All right. Okay. So I'm going to take a stab at this one because let's just say Deleuze and Guattari are by no means accessible. But with that being said, had to do, and I normally try to avoid doing secondary type research because I like to stick with the text itself, at least when I'm talking about it here. But with this text, I've had to, really get all the ammunition I could before approaching it. So of course, this is Anti-Oedipus, and we'll start with chapter 1. I don't know if we make it through, we might go into chapter 2, but I'm thinking this will be a 4-part thing, chapter 1, because it's 4 chapters. But yeah, let's just get right into it. So this chapter opens up a whole kind of new nomenclature, not really a neologism because the word already existed. This idea called schizoanalysis, or schizophrenia as being an opposing force, I could say. And I'm going to deliver many words with reluctance because I feel like a very an adequate reader of Deleuze and Guattari would have big problems with how I'm going to use some words, just because I'm not, fully versed in their kind of lexicon or even Deleuze's entire oeuvre. Anyways, I'm just going to use words that I think fit in the moment. So they open up this idea of schizophrenia as a means to oppose Oedipalization or Oedipus. So for those that aren't familiar, the Oedipus complex coming out of Sophocles, well, not the concept. Freud took up the concept from Oedipus Rex, the idea that, children, young boys mostly, want to, overthrow their father, to take their mother. And then over the course of life, as they grow up, they then sublimate that desire into, the productive faculties in the world. They revert their desire for their mother onto other women. They sublimate their anger towards their father into healthy cooperation and antagonism with other men. But as we can already hear, or we can hear within that idea, the Oedipus complex, we're dealing with very broad understandings of, human organization, where in the case of the mother-father triad, we have 3 very distinct poles, right? That is father, mother, and child. So Deleuze and Guattari almost right off the bat trouble that idea. So they say that no given pole is simply just a kind of a singularity in itself. Rather, it is comprised of a number of different elements. So this is what they call, they are comprised of machines, in a sense. And all of nature is comprised of these machines. And it is in these machines that we can trace desire, that we can trace libidinal energy, that we can trace anything like that. Where these things don't all, in the case of desire, libidinal energy, don't just come from this thing called the id. Unless, of course, we attach to the id, that is the term machine. So the id machine, as maybe one way to understand it. So for example, as they write, the organ machine is plugged into an energy source machine, which is plugged into another machine, another machine, another machine. So another example they give is that a mouth constitutes its own machine that is plugged into the nipple machine of the mother machine, and so on and so forth, that feeds the milk machine into the child. So everything can come down to this understanding of machines. That is, they work within production, or they work by producing. So what they say, and this is on page 3, so this does not mean that we are attempting to make nature one of the poles of schizophrenia. What the schizophrenic experiences, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not at all any one specific aspect of nature, but nature as a process of production. So I realized I kind of glossed over this discussion of nature. they say that a schizophrenic out for a walk, that is in nature, is a better model than a neurotic lying on the analyst's couch. A breath of fresh air, a relationship with the outside world. And they give the example of Lenz's stroll, so that was constructed by Buchner. So this walk outdoors is different from the moments when Lenz finds himself closeted with his pastor, who forces him to situate himself socially in relationship to the God of established religion, in relationship to his father, to his mother. While taking a stroll outdoors, on the other hand, he is in the mountains amid falling snowflakes with other gods or without any gods at all, without a family, without a father or a mother, with nature. So this image that they're drawing here of a schizophrenic in nature, as opposed to neurotic on an analyst's couch, is that there is a degree of almost possibility, but kind of a multitude of possibilities in this kind of natural landscape. But it's important that we don't romanticize this idea of nature, because nature itself can easily be co-opted and kind of given a face that it doesn't have. But as a kind of general model and a point of departure, it does serve a pretty crucial or a pretty useful end. So Oedipus does something to these machines. So it neutralizes them, or in their words, it presupposes a fantastic repression of desiring machines. That is, it doesn't want this discourse of machinic life, of machines, because that would signal like an atomistic quality that doesn't fit within the broader narrative indicative of the Oedipus complex or psychoanalysis, even though I should say right off the bat, they make a distinction, that is, Deleuze and Guattari make a distinction between psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex, where they are really focusing on the Oedipus complex and don't necessarily want to do away with psychoanalysis. In fact, they're trying to reimagine psychoanalysis, but they kind of see no hope for the Oedipus complex. So one other example we could draw would be Foucault in Madness and Civilization. There's a really wonderful, there's a point in it when he says that of all the problems, this isn't verbatim, but he says of all the problems of Freud's thought and psychoanalysis, Foucault says that he at least allowed those people considered abnormal to speak. So they weren't just shut away into homes or shut away into clinics or mental asylums. They were actually given a voice, in a sense. Which, of course, if we think about the later Foucault with the history of sexuality, we've come to find out that giving of a voice is very problematic in itself. So in attributing a kind of value to this schizophrenic analysis, which they're saying is not necessarily anything new, they're saying that this is all, they're kind of just saying all we're doing is describing what is out there. If you look at the goddamn world, this is what you're going to see. So they say that schizophrenia is like love. There's no specifically schizophrenic phenomenon or entity. Schizophrenia is the universe of productive and reproductive desiring machines. Universal primary production is the essential reality of man and nature. So desiring machines don't, or schizophrenia being that point that can then, or that thing that can understand the world or grasp the world, or essentially be in tune with the logic of the world that is not continuous, right? It's comprised of breaks. So this is a term that will kind of come up later. But if we go back to the image I presented earlier that they give us between the child machine or the child's mouth machine and the mother's nipple machine, there's always a break between the two. They can be separated, they can be disjointed, but it's in that possibility that they make a kind of a perfect totality for that moment, but only for a moment, right? As long as one machine relies on the other. So for them, they continue, this is on page 5, desiring machines are binary machines, obeying a binary law or set of rules governing associations. One machine is always coupled with another. So in applying this, I guess, this imagination of the world, or the way they imagine the world, Against the Oedipus complex, they suggest that the satisfaction the handyman experiences when he plugs something into an electric socket or diverts a stream of water can scarcely be explained in terms of playing mommy and daddy, or by the pleasure of violating a taboo. So this Oedipal analysis, that is reducing things to mommy and daddy, comes later, right? At first there was only desiring production, and this is an idea they kind of present later on in the third chapter, actually. But I want to try to present a really broad picture here that gets at hits all the stops. But desiring production has always already been there alongside social production, alongside the social machine, which can be understood as the kind of beginning for Deleuze and Guattari. Okay, now this is where it gets really wacky. Desiring machines, in the case of organ machines specifically, do not make up the totality of being, in a sense. They are not our full kind of ontological condition, because those machines demand some kind of a non-place to be placed onto, than giving it a place, in a sense. And this is where I really want to preface that I hope I don't screw this up, but I think I get it. But we're going to try make sense of this here. So the thing that opposes this desiring production is the body without organs. So this is a pretty central concept in Deleuze and Guattari, especially one that, reading this book, Anti-Oedipus, and then 1,000 Plateaus is a pretty necessary concept to get, even though I can't say for sure I get it, but it's what we got. So in the process of taking upon itself desiring machines, the body undergoes something of a crisis. So by taking on, the finger machine, the lung machine, the heart machine, the body becomes a kind of cathected organization machine itself, where it comes to stand in even for organization, which is, can be really draining, right? We think of that old poem, I'm tired of being a man. It's kind of always inscribed with something. So they say on page 8, desiring machines make us an organism, but at the very heart of this production, within the very production of this production, the body suffers from being organized in this way, from not having some other sort of organization or no organization at all. So the body without organs opposes this kind of production. So they say that the full body without organs is the unproductive, the sterile, the unengendered, the unconsumable. So as they continue on the next page, in order to resist organ machines, the body without organs presents its smooth, slippery, opaque, taut surface as a barrier. So this serves as the basis for their understanding of the initial repression, where they give the example of the paranoiac. So the paranoiac is the being that, embracing a kind of body without organs, resists all desiring machines from entering within it. So these desiring machines are necessary for a person to engage, productively in society, within their own imminence of production. If I made that up, and instead makes them a kind of indeterminate, antisocial being to some extent, because these desiring machines need to, exert themselves over a person before that person can exist within a social machine, within a society machine, or anything like that. So as we might surmise, being kind of a person that is not neurotic nor psychotic in this world would demand something of a give and take between the body without organs and desiring machines. But underneath this, it doesn't give way to this kind of new being, right? There's always this antagonism at play, a kind of difference necessary to maintain that system, which is an idea that, again, comes out later in chapter 3, and to kind of give it a little credence here for a sec. They say that no system or no one has ever died from contradictions, verbatim. I think that's actually what they say. And that, in fact, contradictions and difference are necessary to maintain a system, because only when a system has the capacity to adapt, to change, to recognize things other than itself, and incorporate those in a kind of immunitary paradigm, like the human body, can it actually keep going effectively? So if a system was fully predicated on itself, it would push itself to its own destruction. It's kind of logical conclusion. So there is a necessary relationship between the body without organs and these desiring machines, where, and I hope I didn't fuck that up. Like, this is so complicated, but here they say on 11, the body without organs now falls back on desiring production, attracts it, and appropriates it for its own. The organ machines now cling to the body without organs as though it were a fencer's padded jacket, or as though these organ machines were medals pinned onto the jersey of a wrestler who makes them jingle. So the body without organs, being a kind of blank slate, is the space to record, which is another key term in their kind of book. The body without organs records desiring production in these desiring organs, gives them it's kind of the blank canvas on which they can be projected. So the great example that they give of this whole process is with Judge Scherber. So Judge Scherber was of the utmost interest to Freud and the psychoanalysts because he went insane, right? That quote unquote insane. He was he identified as never himself more than one day at a time. And he kept all these journals, I believe, when he was in these mental asylums, and it was just a really big case and one that was of the utmost interest to the Freudians. So of Scherber, Deleuze and Guattari write that the psychoanalyst says that we must necessarily discover Scherber's daddy beneath his superior God, and doubtless also his older brother beneath his inferior God. At times, the schizophrenic loses his patience and demands to be left alone. Other times he goes along with the whole game, and even invents a few tricks of his own, introducing his own reference points in the model put before him and undermining it from within. So like the entire, how the body without organs, how desiring production, how these machines all oppose the Oedipal narrative, they're suggesting we can do the same to any individual case, right? So this is also them setting the foundation for what would be called, their schizoanalysis. So they take as Scherber not someone who's in need of psychoanalysis, because that's obviously too reductive. Instead, they're saying that this person is much more attuned to kind of schizoanalysis. Now, just to take a moment to kind of outline an issue I have with this, it seems as though in their recognizing a kind of limiting component to psychoanalysis, they seem to be supplanting it with their own, in many ways, even though it's supposedly an open system, limited system in itself. But that's just me. I still haven't been able to, solve that riddle in my head. But just to put it out there, maybe someone has an answer to that. But so the schizo, being a subject like any other, is designated like any other by being recorded on this kind of blank canvas that is the body without organs. So these desiring machines are projected onto this canvas where they exist, where they operate as machines, and then that therefore constitutes that body without organs or that blank canvas as, the space for the desiring machines, as being, I guess in a sense, indiscernible from the machines that are projected onto it. So there's a kind of like simulacral effect here where you have a kind of original canvas that is supplanted with some other territory or some other map, some other mapping, and then that becomes what it is. But of course, it doesn't completely disappear. That would be, don't want to think that. So recording then falls back on production, but the production of recording itself is produced by the production of production. Similarly, recording is followed by consumption, but the production of consumption is produced in and through the production of recording. This is because something on the order of a subject can be discerned on the recording surface. So it is a strange subject, however, with no fixed identity, wandering over the body without organs, but always remaining peripheral to the desiring machines, being defined by the share of the product it takes for itself, garnering here, there, and everywhere a reward in the form of a becoming or an avatar, being born of the states that it consumes and being reborn with each new state. So we can certainly get the idea of how this was these are really radical ideas, even today, because people don't want to believe this shit. That is a kind of ambivalence in identity. And I don't necessarily mean it in terms of identity politics or anything like that, but an identity that is always already negotiated because it's predicated on some very volatile machines, very volatile components that give it its kind of essence. So this radicality is extended when we reconsider this the relationship between two different machines, right, that form a synthesis. So between the mouth machine and the breast machine is a synthesis. But this disjunctive synthesis, that is a break between the two, or there always already being a break, creates an intensity. And this intensity is what propels, difference, or propels change, propels possibility in a sense. So where do these pure intensities come from, they ask? So they come from the two preceding forces, repulsion and attraction, and from the opposition of these two forces. It must not be thought that the intensities themselves are in opposition to one another, arriving at a state of balance around a neutral state. On the contrary, they are all positive in relationship to the zero intensity that designates the full body without organs. The schizophrenic within this whole framework, kind of being maybe the subject attuned to these kinds of intensities, maybe, undergoes kind of a threefold process that forms a kind of trinary. And they are as follows. This is on 22, I guess, 22, 23, where they say that first is dissociation. So the schizophrenic locates the specific dysfunction or primary deficiency. Okay, number 2, autism, so delirium or complete detachment from the world. Number 3, being in the world, discovery of a place in own specific world. So this formulation of the schizophrenic is one kind of pushed by what they call the materialist or material psychiatrists, in a sense that they have a problem with, right? So while there is something to be said about its formula remaining true to a kind of schizophrenic imaginary, they all point to this idea of an ego. So the kind of Freudian concept there, which they call the final avatar of the soul, a vague conjoining of the requirements of spiritualism and positivism. So these steps or these processes, while interesting, only refer back to the Oedipal paradigm and are therefore a kind of closed system that is incapable of recognizing, anything else. So the ego, as they continue, is like daddy mommy. The schizo has long since ceased to believe in it. He is somewhere else, beyond or behind or below these problems, rather than immersed in them. So the Oedipal complex kind of grounded, territorialized the ego to some extent. So the ego was, for Deleuze and Guattari, and this is what I was saying earlier, they're kind of, they don't totally lament psychoanalysis. They say that psychoanalysis was in a sense good when it was focused on desire, right? And then when, the Oedipus complex came in, then it totally grounded all these concepts where before there was a kind of malleability to them. So desire, in this transition from the psychoanalytic paradigm to the Oedipal one, underwent kind of a transformation. So at one time, desire wasn't necessarily understood as want for something someone lacked, right? And this is the classic problem of desire, where it's traditionally understood as being want for something that you lack. So of this, they say, and I'll read this in length, on 25, to a certain degree, the traditional logic of desire is all wrong from the very outset. From the very first step that the Platonic logic of desire forces us to take, making us choose between production and acquisition. From the moment that we place desire on the side of acquisition, we make desire an idealistic, dialectical, nihilistic conception, which causes us to look upon it as primarily a lack of an object, a lack of the real object. it is true that the other side, the production side, has not been entirely ignored. Kant, for instance, must be credited with effecting a critical revolution as regards the theory of desire by attributing to it the faculty of being, through its representations, the cause of the reality of the objects of these representations. So in opposition to this, desire should be understood as part and parcel with the process of production, where in it you always are in the moving towards something other, right? Something new that you don't necessarily know about, right? And that's, I think, the difference, where in the psychoanalytic imaginary, the Oedipal one, you desire that which you know about. Whereas in production, if we accept the world as desiring production, we always, in this process, because we're never, stagnant, moving into new things. But it's not something you necessarily have a knowledge of, because that would totally go against the principle, at least the one that I believe is present in 1,000 Plateaus, when they want to do away with this thing called, the subject, this thing called identity. How they illustrate this is by trying to remove faces or question, why is it that humans are so obsessed with people's faces? And that's because we've invested in the face the idea of a subject. Like, that is who you are, right? We recognize you by your face. But doing away with all this, they open up a kind of radical potential for giving oneself over to this desiring production, to the kind of flows, the systems of the world, in a sense. So as they say on page 26, when the theoretician reduces desiring production to a production of fantasy, he is content to exploit to the fullest the idealist principle that defines desire as a lack, rather than as a process of production, industrial production. This is because desire and the object that it's moving towards or striving for are the same thing in the machinic imagination. That is because they are both machines. Whereas in the Oedipal one, you have a subject, supposedly, that sees an object that will fulfill its fantasy, right? Whereas, Lauren Berlant kind of frames it a kind of cruel optimism. Like, attaining this thing will make you, as a subject, better. Deleuze and Guattari want to strip that away, suggesting that they are both machines. So, subject-machine, if I can even call it that, is part and parcel of a desiring machine that desires an object machine that, moves in a kind of cycle. So in terms of a kind of egoistic situation that is in Freud, so the ego kind of corresponding to the social contract in a sense, or your being in society, or your being an agent in that society, that world. I think I'm understanding that right. Deleuze and Guattari say that the social machine or social production is just another phase or another identity of desiring production under certain circumstances, or as they say on 29. Social production is purely and simply desiring production itself under determinate conditions. So in this social paradigm, it serves the interest of those in power. I kind of use that term broadly. Those in power to instill the idea of lack, right? So in terms of the fantasy or in desire or in want, kind of instilling lack into the people so that they lose sight of their being machines, right? Because suddenly if they introduce lack, they introduce objects that will ostensibly satisfy those lacks. And in doing so, kind of retroactively construct the subject as subject that is defined not in their kind of immanence, but in their being differentiated from the objects. So they and I think I've made this fairly clear, they don't want to do away with all the kind of narratives present in Oedipal or psychoanalytic imaginary, that is fantasy or desire or lack. They just want to understand them in different terms. So as they say, so desiring machines are not fantasy machines or dream machines, which supposedly can be distinguished from technical or social machines. Rather, fantasies are secondary expressions, deriving from the identical nature of the two sorts of machines in any given set of circumstances. Thus, fantasy is never individual. It is a group fantasy, and as institutional analysis has successfully demonstrated. And art, in many ways, for them serves this function, or art, this is on 31, art often takes advantage of this property of desiring machines by creating veritable group fantasies in which desiring production is used to short-circuit social production and to interfere with the reproductive function of technical machines by introducing an element of dysfunction, which makes total sense because that doesn't totally oppose the logic of the social machines or social production, because if we follow through with their claims, that is always already a system predicated on dysfunction, predicated on disjunctions, predicated on breaks and ruptures. So introducing this art machine into it does comply to its logic to some extent, but in a kind of intensified form that opposes the organizational trends of the other systems. And this whole discussion of the kind of social paradigm, or this idea of a group fantasy, leads them to say that, the masses, in a sense, always wanted fascism, because then it's, they don't have to take it upon themselves to do the thinking, because we are all, in a sense, geared towards giving ourselves over to something else, in the case of machines, for example, that wrest us away from a kind of subjectivity, kind of individuality that is, for them, pretty repressive. Fuck, I hope I'm not screwing this all up. I hope if I am, someone will tell me off. So things need to be organized to some extent, right? Things can't be left totally, off the rails. So historically, the socius, so kind of like social organization that is comprised of codes, traditions, anything like that, is responsible for how they say coding and recoding and decoding and so on and so forth, the flows of desire. So they have to be contained to some extent, and they're contained within a specific kind of epistemic framework. So in any given situation, there are various codes, traditions, beliefs, cultures, identities, whatever, that comply to the limits of that system. So this is the condition of the kind of quote-unquote primitive situation, where in the pre-capitalist, pre-industrial, pre-modern, you had organizations that were simply predicated on coding flows. So in any kind of given territory, that is how the flow would be coded. It was based on the conventions of that territory. So they give two opposing examples to that. They give the example of despotism, which I think, fascism or totalitarianism, that works by overcoding, setting in very strict guidelines that are kind of legislated. And then, if you don't comply, you're going to get owned. And then they oppose it with the capitalist machine. That is the one that decodes, right? So there doesn't seem to be any kind of conventions or rules or laws or anything like that, where there's a kind of free flow of anything, which they don't totally admonish. They, in a sense, both celebrate it and, caution against it, because, it does, in a sense, speak to the very logic of these machines that don't ascribe to a set code per se, except the code of machines themselves, which are indeterminate. So in that sense, it kind of speaks to this system, but they do, and this is especially in Thousand Plateaus, they are a little bit concerned about it. Or just put it in their terms here, under deterritorialization. So within capitalism, the real is not impossible. It is just simply more and more artificial. So in this system, in this capitalist framework, where there is this decoding of the flows of desire, what we see are the developments of, and this is a term that Maurizio Lazzarato uses. I don't know if anyone else uses it, but I'm taking it from him. We see the emergence of compensatory territories that serve the end of satisfying our desire for various territories through various repressive institutions. So then we get territorialized by the family, by the state, by the school, by the hospital, by whatever you want. That are all responses to the decoded flows of advanced industrial capitalism. so that people don't feel totally, out of their element. And Oedipus is in many ways just another response to that, is another compensatory territory that seeks to ground the world in its, daddy, mommy, triad, daddy, mommy, child triad, in order to make the world more accessible, right? To make it make more sense, when in fact this world is, to use one of Baudrillard's terms, kind of achieved escape velocity and is now floating off into the ether. So then we get into the syntheses, which is the most complicated part of this for me. And I want to try and understand it in the way I can understand it. So, okay. The three syntheses are as follows. First, you have the connective synthesis. Second, you have the disjunctive synthesis. And then third, you have the conjunctive synthesis. Now, these may seem kind of oxymoronic, paradoxical, where you have a disjunctive synthesis. What is that? How do you have a disjunctive synthesis? Well, I need to turn to Hegel and Marx to try and understand this one, or at least this is how I think I understand it. So, and I'm taking this idea from G.A. Cohen, who writes about Hegel and Marx's dialectical configuration. So what Cohen says is that specifically, let's talk about Marx, you have three stages. So you have the pre-capitalist, capitalist, and then communist. Now I want to say, before I go further, that I don't think there's a clear, there's a smooth transition from what I'm about to outline and the one that Deleuze and Guattari put forward, but I think it's a good point of departure. So you have these three stages, right? Pre-capitalist, capitalist, and then communist. So the pre-capitalist logic was guided by a logic of undifferentiated unity. The capitalist one was guided by a logic of differentiated disunity. And the third one, communism, guided by the logic of differentiated unity. So the same can be observed in Hegel, right? Where, there's the recognition in the second phase of recognizing self and other, or the distinction between self and other. So this differentiated disunity, where there's kind of breaking apart, before arriving at the kind of collective recognition of selves in relation to other selves as other, which then can form their own kind of community of individuals, community of selves. So I think we can understand this in similar terms here. So there, what Deleuze and Guattari give us, the connective synthesis, so that can relate to the undifferentiated unity. So that's where people are totally, one in the same with one another. Number two, disjunctive synthesis, where you have differentiated disunity, where they are not connected, nor do they subscribe to an overall same formula. And then third, a conjunctive synthesis that corresponds to the maintenance of a kind of individuality that is, under the same rubric. So I think we can apply these syntheses to the broader movements of history in a sense, where you have the kind of savage, quote unquote savage, primitive ones corresponding to the connective synthesis, where they are just coded in their codes. The disjunctive one corresponding to a more industrial, kind of imperialistic one. And then the third one, conjunctive synthesis, being the advanced kind of capitalist one. I think, right? And I really want to stress my ignorance of this because it's so difficult. So to kind of make sense of this, I'm going to turn to another text, which I don't like doing, but this person is believes what they're doing is correct. So this is Stephen Shaviro. You can Google this. It's what is it called? The connective and disjunctive syntheses. Pretty clear, I guess. So he says that the first synthesis, the connective synthesis of production, can be identified with the actual labor process. That is to say, with purposeful activity that transforms the world. So This is the universal primary production, in the course of which human industry has a fundamental identity with nature as production of man and by man. So strictly speaking, this process is not, or is not yet, subjective. Okay, fair. I think we're corresponding still to this kind of primitive idea. So within that paradigm, you always already have then the disjunctive synthesis, which is for them the synthesis of recording, which both organizes the connective process and appropriates its products. So in the connective synthesis, there is no need to distinguish between production and its product. The pure thisness of the object produced is carried over into a new act of producing. But in the disjunctive synthesis of recording, the product is taken out of the flow, separated from the production process of which it was a part. This is what transforms it into a commodity, in its pure thisness. It was an ordinary sensuous thing, but as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness, Marx says. So in this process, the first connective synthesis is branched upon and subordinated to the disjunctive synthesis. This is why capitalism presents us with a fetishistic, perverse, bewitched world in which the apparent objective movement of the full body of the socius appears to us as the motor of social reproduction. Although the disjunctive synthesis depends both logically and materially upon the connective synthesis, it always appears as if the second synthesis came first, and this appearance is itself a basic principle of social organization and social production. So then finally, according to Shaviro, the connective synthesis of production is presubjective or transsubjective. So the disjunctive synthesis of recording is estranging and asubjective. It is only in the third synthesis, the conjunctive synthesis of consumption, that something on the order of a subject can be discerned for the first time. This subject is not the traditional philosophical one. It is too insubstantial, too fleeting and transitory. It emerges abruptly and unexpectedly, and it dissolves just as quickly. So when feeling swells beyond a certain point, so that a threshold is crossed, a subject is precipitated into existence. So I think, oh my God, I think this is like when blood flows into the heart, like the heart expands and then the blood rushes in and then it pushes it out, rushes in, pushes it out. Like that is the subject. Like the subject goes in these fleeting moments and then disappears and comes in and disappears. So in this process of becoming a subject, even in the last stage, the conjunctive stage, synthesis, they are never a subject for more than a moment, right? That idea of subjectivity is out the window. But I hope that, and it's kind of a lazy thing to do for me to explain it by presenting other ideas, but he probably says it best. So, but to return to Deleuze and Guattari again, they say of these syntheses that they correspond to three different movements, right? So the first is the production of production, the second is the production of recording, and the third is the production of consumption, right? Where consumption, I would assume this is where the subject comes in, where you can't have consumption unless there's a subject consuming, something consuming, right? But it would seem as though then machines could be very subjective, or can be subjects, because the machine is, consuming what it needs to keep operating as a machine. This is also present in Marx in the Grundrisse, right, where he says that production is always already consumption and consumption is always already production, where you have productive consumption or productive consumption and consumptive production, right? So the producing agent, the laborer, needs to consume in order to produce, and consumption can only be consumption by being produced. So I think that's how it works. So at best, we are looking for like ruptures and breaks and disjunctive syntheses and, inconsistencies. We are not looking for totalities that they tell us. And they give us the example of Melanie Klein, who they said, identifies all these what they call partial objects, but then ascribes them to the logic of the totality. And this reducing to totality serves the end of maintaining power in the hands of some, right? Because it turns the world, or it makes the world susceptible to a totalizing narrative, that is of daddy, mommy, through this Oedipal narrative that can ground people in a sense. It territorializes them into the narrative or into the idea that, those in power can then benefit off of. Holy God. Okay, I think that will wrap this up. There's more to it here, obviously, than I could get to, but it's so difficult. And I'm trying to demonstrate my humility, because, I can't say I know this stuff for sure. I just happen to be reading it, and, I could put content up here, so I didn't want to lose sight of that, or didn't want to miss that opportunity. But for those that listened, I would certainly hope you'd tell me where I went wrong. Correct me where I'm wrong. You could be as mean as you want. I don't give a fuck. You do whatever you want. But, as long as I learn. But on that note, for those that listened,